Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. Sorry for a couple of minutes delay on getting started here. We were trying to make sure that we had everything in place for us. My name is Bill Baker. I'm with Firestorm, located in Atlanta. So we just went through the tail end of Irma as it passed over us. Today we're going to be talking about what should every leader know, crisis intuition. This is part of the Crisis Coach webinar series that is presented by the Virginia Association of Independent Schools, and we're pleased to have you joining us for this webinar. We'd also like to have you as our friend. On Facebook, we're known as Firestorm Solutions. We have a Twitter account. You can follow us on Twitter at Firestorm Solutions. Firestorm Soul. Twitter always abbreviates everything. There is a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Firestorm is America's crisis coach. We'd like to remind you the presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion, and this work product should be discussed in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. In addition, do not interpret this information as legal advice or legal opinion. Today we've got with us Kim Phelan. She's with the Virginia Association of Independent Schools. We don't have Ryan with us. We have the better one. We've got Ken Mercer with us. Kim, over to you for some nice comments about our good partner, Virginia Association of Independent Schools.
Well, I really just want to continue to say to everyone that we really relish this connection with Firestorm, and it's been a great resource for our folks in a number of ways through these very resource-rich webinars that are offered, but also an opportunity for our folks to have a 1-hour no-cost consultation with Firestorm folks if they should get in a crisis. So we continue to relish this relationship, and we're so glad to kick off another school year with you.
Great, and congratulations on getting started for a new school year. Everybody is happy to have kids back in school, and I'm sure you're doing a fine job. You can go to firestorm.com and watch past webinars in this series or register for future ones. Ken Mercer, do you have any comments you'd like to make before we put it over to our presenter today?
Hi, good morning. I haven't tested my audio yet, so I trust that it's working. I wanted to just thank the Virginia Association. We too relish this relationship, and looking forward to hearing Guy Higgins today, former franchisee of the year for Firestorm. So we will have a lot of good things today, and I look forward to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken. Our presenter today is Guy Higgins. Guy is located in Colorado. He is a Navy officer, former naval officer, went to the academy, and he's been with Firestorm now for a number of years. He's really a very intelligent person, and we enjoy hearing from him. So, Guy, over to you, please.
Thanks, Bill. And just for the record, I'm also much better looking than my picture. So, leadership in crisis. I want to start, because I'm a storyteller, I want to start with a story. In the Northern Hemisphere summer of 1914, Ernest Shackleton assembled an expedition aimed at crossing the Antarctic continent on foot. He assembled that expedition and sailed from England in the late Northern Hemisphere summer, sailing down to New South Georgia in the Falkland Islands. He got there toward the end of August of 1914, and the locals there in New South Georgia told Ernest Shackleton that their summer, which was just approaching, looked to be a cold summer, that the spring had been abnormally cold, that the sea ice was the worst that they had seen in years, and that they thought he was probably being rash in proposing to go down to the continent and try to cross it on foot. Now, in 1914, late August 1914, there were a couple of other things that were going on in the world. One was the opening of the Panama Canal, and both that event and Ernest Shackleton's expedition were relegated to the back pages of the newspapers by the beginning of World War I, which, as one historian observed, was Europe committing suicide. So Shackleton is now in the Falkland Islands in the southern hemisphere, coming up on what looks to be an abnormally cold and bitter summer in some of the worst weather and sea conditions in the world, and he elects to pursue his expedition to the southern, to the Antarctic continent. And he sails from New South Georgia, and before they reach Antarctica, his ship and the expedition gets stuck in the ice. For about a month and a half, Shackleton and his expedition entertain themselves stuck in the ice, waiting for summer to warm up and break the sea ice. That did not happen. Shackleton and the expedition took the picture of themselves standing on the Antarctic ice, the picture that you're looking at right now, standing by the bow of their ship on the Antarctic ice in midsummer, southern hemisphere. And rather than seeing the ice break up, what happened was the ice capsized and destroyed the ship, crushed it. Let's look at the first of those pair case studies. I want to first talk about Malaysia Air Flight MH370, which is the flight that departed from Kuala Lumpur and within the first hour disappeared from radar, and we still don't know what actually happened, the details of what happened to that flight or how the people on board it died. It took off out of Kuala Lumpur, and within about 15 minutes, civil aviation lost radar contact on it, and the Malaysian government announced that they had lost radar contact and they were investigating that. At that point, it was the government that did that because Malaysia Air is a nationally sponsored airline. The government got on the radio and TV and started making announcements. At this point, they actually knew nothing other than the fact that they had lost, that civil aviation had lost radar contact with the flight. They got on and began to talk about what they were doing. Remember, at this point, they didn't actually know much at all. And it's important to understand that when something happens, you're either going to know everything you need to know very quickly, or you're not going to know anything at all for a while, and most of the first stuff that you learn is going to be wrong. It's important to understand that because that creates pressure because people expect leaders to act. So the Malaysian government got on the media and began to make announcements. Unfortunately, many of those announcements were vague and confusing, and they published information that later turned out to be inaccurate and in some cases absolutely wrong. It turns out that although commercial aviation had lost radar contact, that military radar continued to maintain contact for about another 10 minutes before they too lost contact. And so it took a while to find out what was going on. Eventually, the track that you see in that graphic to the right was generated based on information that was telemetered from the aircraft via satellite back to maintenance facilities. But that, once again, wasn't known necessarily at the time. So were the leaders in the Malaysian government under pressure? Oh, absolutely they were. They were under terrible pressure to tell people what was going on. Hundreds of people have disappeared and nobody knows what's happened to them. There's enormous pressure to do something. Was the decision-making easy or difficult? Oh, it was incredibly difficult. Were there ethical challenges? And this is a point I'm going to come back to several times. We're faced with a situation like that as human beings. We are enormously tempted, pressured to be optimistic about what's happening and to paint a rosy picture, and that can frequently lead people in wrong directions. That is an ethical challenge that we have to be very careful of. Was the government successful in managing downstream consequences? No, they were not. Malaysia Air took an enormous blow to their reputation and their brand image, and in fact, they're still recovering from that in terms of revenue, in terms of international reputation and ridership. In contrast to that, and interestingly enough, just within several weeks of the disappearance of Malaysia Air Flight 370, AirAsia, a low-cost airline in Asia, experienced a crash right after takeoff. Unlike the Malaysia Air event, people knew what had happened. The airplane crashed. They knew where it happened. They knew that there were an enormous number of fatalities. The airline, AirAsia, immediately began contacting the listed emergency contacts on the flight manifest. They began talking to people at the departure point. They contacted people at the arrival point. They got out on the media and said what they knew. The airplane had crashed. There were fatalities. They did not paint a rosy picture or a pessimistic picture. The CEO of AirAsia flew to the departure point and began speaking with the people, the families of the passengers, telling them what was going on, speaking to them in a group, and then speaking to each of them individually. AirAsia flew people from the intended arrival airport down to the departure point where AirAsia had their operations center for this emergency and crisis, and paid for hotels and lodging and food for everybody who was there, talked to them throughout the next several days and explained to them what was going on and kept them abreast of what was happening. In these two cases, Malaysia Air behaved as if they did not have a plan. AirAsia behaved as if they had a plan. In fact, they behaved as if they had actually written a script for this kind of a situation. They had thought through it and knew what they wanted to do. So for Malaysia Air, decision-making was difficult because they hadn't apparently thought it through. For AirAsia, they made decisions quickly and they made good decisions. They had something there to guide them through it. Therefore, they weren't facing the same kind of paint a rosy picture ethical challenges that Malaysia Air was facing. And AirAsia managed the consequences of this disaster much better than did Malaysia Air, and recovered quickly, both in terms of its reputation and its brand. And it's important to look at that because they were prepared for this and they acted easily, confidently as the emergency unfolded, as opposed to the stumbling and inaccuracies that were accompanied the Malaysia Air follow on. So moving from that to British Petroleum and Chevron, BP had the catastrophe of the Deepwater Horizon. And everybody knows that the Deepwater Horizon catastrophe in the Gulf of Mexico was an environmental disaster. However, in addition to that, it involved the loss of life of 11 men who were working on contract for British Petroleum. BP came out and said, we've had this problem, there's been an explosion, there's been a fire, there's fatalities, but once again, they began to feel the pressure of what was going on. They understood that they had petroleum leaking flowing into the Gulf of Mexico, a sensitive ecosystem, and they first came out and minimized it. They talked about being hundreds of barrels when it turned out to be tens of thousands of barrels per hour. And they minimized that. They made statements that later turned out to be inaccurate because, once again, they didn't know what was happening right up front. And that's not a criticism, that's just a fact of life. You don't always know. They were under pressure, decision-making was difficult. They did not do a good job of communicating with all the stakeholders. They did not do a good job of dealing with the environmental catastrophe or with the loss of life. And those are two entirely different situations that they had to deal with. Certainly there were ethical challenges. People were dead. That has to be treated with the importance that is attached to it. They did not manage the consequences well. BP is still recovering financially and reputationally from that disaster. They did not handle it well. The CEO wound up getting fired. It was an absolute disaster for BP. I keep emphasizing that. In contrast, Chevron had an explosion and oil fire at one of their refineries in Southern California. That happens to be a picture of the fire that we pulled off the internet, and that is the refinery at Long Beach. For anybody who's ever driven down the 405, you drive right by that refinery. In contrast to BP, which held press conferences and issued press releases, Chevron jumped on Twitter, and they began to tweet about every 2 to 5 minutes while this fire's in place. And as you read through the tweets, which we're not going to take the time to do, but as you read through the tweets, you can see that they were balancing very closely between being optimistic and being pessimistic. They said, we don't know. We don't know that there are any injuries or fatalities. We don't know right now. We'll notify people as soon as we can. First responders are on scene. We're beginning to do this. We'll make this right. We're going to take care of our people. We will invest in correcting any damage that is done to the surrounding community. And as you can see, the smoke that's generated by that fire is horrendous. And even though this was about 6 years ago, I'm certain that a lot of that smoke is still in the atmosphere in Los Angeles. But Chevron came out and they tweeted continuously throughout this. Then they held press conferences. They issued press releases in addition to their Twitter activity. And they actually did an excellent job. They behaved as if, once again, they'd written a script for this particular situation. It's obvious that they had thought through it, that they had plans in place, they knew what they were going to say, they knew the kinds of decisions with which they would be faced, and they made the decisions and they managed the consequences. They did not face ethical challenges because they had something in place. They'd already thought through that and made their decisions. It's an excellent case of how positively to handle the situation. So now let's look at a couple of schools. Just after the start of the school year 3 years ago, LSU was notified that there was a bomb on campus. Now, this was to be taken very seriously because in the preceding couple of months there had been numerous bomb threats at universities throughout the U.S. And in some of those cases, the bomb threats were actual, there were actual bombs found on campuses. So LSU knew that this was serious, and even though just the threat is serious, they had to take this one particularly seriously. They had a plan. Use Twitter. Tweet to everybody to implement an evacuation of the campus. Now, that's the tweet they sent out. A bomb threat's been reported. Please evacuate as calmly and quickly as possible. Now, a little aside here. The campus for LSU is about 360 acres. That's about 3/8 of a square mile. So no matter how you arrange that campus, there is no way that you can possibly be more than 400 or 500 yards from off campus. Now, almost everybody on the LSU campus is physically capable of walking 400 or 500 yards to evacuate the campus. Did they? Well, of course not. This is America. They all jumped out in their cars and immediately joined one of the largest linear parking lots in Louisiana. And you can see that picture there. It took hours to clear the traffic jam that caused. Now, LSU obviously had done some planning. They had thought about what would happen if they had to evacuate the campus. Twitter's an excellent tool to get information out to people quickly, particularly in a situation where you know that you have already told the students, staff, and faculty that they should, subscribe to your Twitter feed, and didn't train or exercise to that and think about what can go wrong. Remember, anything that can go wrong will go wrong. That's Mr. Murphy's Law. And the important thing to remember about that is that Murphy was an optimist. So it's important to go through and not just do the planning, but to train on the plans and to exercise the plans in order to find out what Mr. Murphy's going to do to you if you have to actually do it. Was the pressure on? Absolutely. You got a bomb threat. People could be injured or killed. It's important to do that. Make decisions? Absolutely. It was easy for LSU to order they hadn't thought through what would happen with that, and that created subsequent decisions they had to make that were difficult because it impeded first responder response and getting on campus. It impeded the exit, the evacuation of people who couldn't walk off, and in an organization as large as LSU, there are obviously going to be people who have reduced abilities and can't get off campus by walking, or that's not the best way to do it. Did they face ethical challenges? Anytime people's lives or safety is at risk, there are going to be ethical challenges. And once again, they hadn't thought through this, so there were consequences that they were not successful at managing. In contrast to that, a little bit of contrast to that, Chardon High School in Cleveland, Ohio, experienced an armed intruder incident where a young man entered the cafeteria of the school and began shooting students. Chardon had just done an exercise on their active shooter plan. And so the notification to the police and emergency first responders was immediate. The teachers in the cafeteria responded immediately, and the incident was over within a couple of minutes. The active shooter phase of the incident was over within a couple of minutes. The school went into lockdown, and the incident was over. The average armed intruder incident lasts less than 5 minutes. And Chardon did much better than that. So they ended the active shooter part of it. They're in lockdown. Now, what Chardon hadn't realized, and what's really important for schools to realize, is that every single student in that school was a broadcaster. They all have their smartphones, and they all set up their little broadcast studios, and they began broadcasting from downtown Chardon High School. And the news media took advantage of that, and they began tweeting back, asking for comments and observations from the students. The students, all looking for their 15 minutes of fame, responded immediately, and there was an enormous wave of misinformation coming out of Chardon High School because, once again, what you know at the beginning of an incident is not going to be correct. What the students knew at the beginning of the incident was even less than not correct. And so there's a lot of misinformation going out there, and it made it very difficult. Now, Chardon did a good job of corralling some of that after the fact, but it created some problems and consequences in that first several hours after the incident was going on. And of course, when they know that there's been something like that and they don't know who has been injured, is anybody dead? So once again, the plan was there. They behaved. They executed the plan well. They hadn't thought through this social media phenomena that they were going to have to deal with. So leadership, there's mistakes in that. And once again, going back, Ernest Shackleton did not have plan B when he got down to the Falklands, and the situation was different than he expected. He hadn't done the planning, the what-if planning up front. And leadership needs to make sure that that happens. Take the action before the event. What does that mean? It means develop a strategy. How are you as an organization, as a school, going to respond to an event, an emergency, a crisis? How are you going to recover from it? What considerations do you have? What are the statutory requirements you have for reporting or responding? What are the regulatory requirements for responding and reporting? What, if any, ethical issues might you face, and how are you going to respond to those? Think through those things when you can sit around a table with a cup of coffee and talk about it and investigate it and tweeze it apart to look at those things, so that when you plan, you can consider those things and put together plans that take those into consideration. And the plans need to include not only what to do, but how to do it. Out here in Colorado, we had a school incident in which there was a young lady killed, and one of the administrative staff went to dial 911, picked up the phone, and under the pressure of the incident, could not remember 911. And that's not that unusual. As human beings, evolution has made us freeze, flee, or fight. It hasn't made us remember 911. So it's important not only to say what to do, but how to do it. And then once that plan's in place, train on it. What does that mean? It means make sure that the people covered by the plan know what their role is. My role might simply be to evacuate the building. My role might be to lock the door. Make sure that I know what my role is and I know how to do it. Once that training is done, then let's exercise it. And that exercise is important. Professional sports teams play. They exercise against their next opponent. And they do that so that they can develop experience dealing with that situation. And that's really important. And that's what I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. What are the barriers to preparedness? Leadership, I just talked about leadership doing that. Well, anytime you have a strategy, there are barriers to strategy. And those barriers can include things like attitudes. And that's really important. Disaster denial. Well, I've had a company tell me, you know, we've been in business 60 years and we've never had that problem. Well, okay, so when do you plan to go out of business? Because if you plan to stay in business, the chances that you will eventually have that problem get bigger and bigger all the time. It may only be, you know, 1 in 1,000 every year, but 1 in 1,000 adds up when your horizon extends out to, I don't plan to go out of business next year. What we have is good enough, and it may be good enough, but if you haven't trained on it and you haven't exercised it, you don't know that. And so it's important not to get sucked into, well, you know, it was good enough last year, it's good enough this year. You don't necessarily know that. And this is one that my business partner Jennifer Friedman and I experienced just last year. You know, we as an organization have successfully dealt with all sorts of problems in the past. We're really good at problem solving. We don't need plans. Well, fact of the matter is, just because you've been successful in the past doesn't mean you're going to be successful in the future. The future is not just an extension of the past. You need to have plans, but there are problems with that because there are conflicting priorities. As schools, you have a mission to educate your students, to keep them safe, to educate them. And going out and investing in plans for things that have low probability of occurrence but a high impact, that takes time. And it's not like teachers have a lot of extra time or staff have a lot of extra time. Resources. The reason you have to have priorities and the reason they come into conflict is because nobody has extra resources. Nobody has a bottom drawer full of extra resources that are unused. Culture can be a barrier. It can be an asset or it can be a barrier. It just depends on whether or not it supports or resists becoming prepared. And leaders need to address the culture as well as everything else. Lack of ownership. If people don't feel that the plan is theirs, they don't have ownership, and it's difficult for people then to embrace and execute that plan. In fact, legal opinion can also be a problem. So I will tell you that we have had a situation where the attorneys for the organization said, we don't think you ought to have that plan, because if you have that plan and you don't execute it precisely, then you are open to being sued. That's not a terribly good legal opinion, and so that can be a barrier. Overcoming them, leaders need to not just be the directive leader, they need to be a participative leader and bring in members of the community to help lead the effort to become prepared. Rely on people who have the expertise and the experience within the organization. Leaders need to communicate about why this is important. This is important because we as the leaders of the organization think that the mission's important, that the students are important, the staff's important, the faculty's important. We want to protect you and we want to continue to be able to do our mission and educate students. Need to be transparent, need to make sure that people see what's going on and understand why it's happening. There needs to be follow through. We can't just develop the plans and put them on the shelf. The bookshelf will stay there in place by virtue of gravity, not because the plan's holding it down. You have to follow through and train and exercise on that plan and have to reach out and build ownership in that. Why do we do this? Because building muscle memory with that training and that exercise is important. That's the playing the game plan. It helps us to develop intuition, which is not some magical sense of how to do things or what's happening. Intuition is experience, and you don't get experience in emergencies and exercises except through training on them and exercises. Those exercises build confidence and they yield better performance. I'm going to tell another story here because, as I said, I'm a storyteller. At one point in my career, I worked for Vice Admiral, that's a 3-star, Vice Admiral Paul McCarthy, really good guy. Paul had been a Navy captain in command of an aircraft carrier in the Western Pacific, and they did a war game. And Paul said it was awful. It was just awful. It made, you know, the Keystone Cops look good. He said then Paul was promoted to 1-star and given command of a carrier battle group in the Western Pacific, taking the place of the guy who had been his boss. and they had a war game, another war game, and they did better. The next cycle, Paul had been promoted again, was a 2-star, and he was now in command of the Carrier Task Force, which is a bigger organization, and they did a war game, and they were better at it then. And then he eventually got his 3rd star and was commander of the U.S. 7th Fleet, and they had an annual war game again. Now, Paul's been out there for 6 or 7 of these war games over this entire span, and he said, you know, he said, we really felt like we knew what we were doing. We actually did a good job on that. Your performance gets better the more you exercise those plans and capabilities. So, leadership. During pre-action, leaders need to reach out to create the team, the plan, and the experience and the exercises. During a crisis, that allows muscle memory to take over, and there's no need for Ernest Shackleton type superhuman leadership to sail and navigate 1,200 miles through the Antarctic Ocean back to the Falklands to save the people that you put in danger in the first place. That planning, training, exercising builds that intuition, that muscle memory. So what comes next? This webinar will be rewritten into a brief that will be available on the Firestorm website, and you can see that it will be right there. If you go to the Firestorm website, you'll be able to download that brief and see what it is that I had to say, and I can't wait to see what I had to say. So with that, we have a couple of minutes. Bill?
Yes, sir.
Is there anything else that you want to add?
No. If anyone has any questions, they can use the question facility over on the right side of the screen to type something in.
So that if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them either now or we'll get an answer to you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Guy. Good presentation, good information, and hope we can be the kind of leaders that we should be.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everyone.